As you watch a gunslinger emerge from a shimmering desert horizon, you realize he looks a lot like the tight-lipped, cigar-chewing sharpshooter from Hang 'em High. And when you look at it on paper, High Plains Drifter certainly reads like your typical Clint Eastwood Western. It's a story of a mysterious crack-shot out-of-towner who's paid handsomely to protect a California mining community from outlaws. This was basically standard fare for Eastwood in the 1973 era. In reality, the film that was Eastwood's second attempt at directing is pretty atypical. High Plains Drifter is a blackly comedic movie, basically made when Eastwood was still considered little more than a conservative prop with a gun. It's a keenly spiritual film, with such high themes dealing with the corrosive power of violence. The film was done in 1973, and it was written by Ernest Tidyman and produced by Robert Daly for Clint Eastwood's Malpaso Company and Universal Pictures. This film was greatly influenced by the work of Eastwood's two major collaborators, that being film director Sergio Leone and Don Siegel. In addition to Eastwood, the film also stars Verna Bloom, Mariana Hill, Mitchell Ryan, Jack Ging, and Stefan Garash. The film was shot on location, on the shores of Mono Lake, California. Universal Pictures really wanted the film to be shot on a studio lot, but instead, Clint Eastwood had a whole town built in this desert town of Mono Lake in the California Sierras. Many of the buildings that were constructed were three-dimensional, not just facades, and this was done so that the interior shots could be shot on location too. Clint Eastwood actually scouted the locations himself while driving a pickup truck through Oregon, Nevada, and California. He chose the shores of Mono Lake because he considered the area highly photogenic. Additional scenes were filmed in Reno, Nevada, and also in California's Inyo National Forest. The town of Lago is actually 300 miles from Hollywood, and it was constructed by a 46-man crew of technicians and laborers who worked 10-hour days for 18 days straight, constructing the 14 houses and the two-story hotel. Once filming was completed, they actually burned the entire set down. The editing for the movie was actually done in a log cabin on the shores of Mono Lake, pretty close to the location of the town they built. The strange colors that make up the town of Lago look different throughout the day scenes. He also supplemented these with eerie music and weird dream sequences that all added to the supernatural atmosphere of the movie. Another interesting thing about the filming process in this movie is that he filmed everything in sequence. It was all done in order, and that's rarely done in Hollywood. It actually takes about 7 minutes for the film to elapse before Clint Eastwood actually says a word of dialogue, and this is despite him being in the movie from the very first frame. The stranger that he plays is pretty similar to the man with no name persona that's familiar to the Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns, and they even wear a similar hat. The character in this movie has no personal name and is only referred to in the billing as the stranger. Any holes that they came across in the plot were filmed with black humor, an allegory to Sergio Leone. Eastwood thought the allegory of this movie was a speculation on what happens when they go ahead and kill the sheriff, and someone comes back and calls the town's conscience to bear, suggesting that there's always retribution for your deeds. The character of Marshal Jim Duncan, the man that gets whipped to death in the middle of the town, is played by stuntman Buddy Van Horn, a longtime stunt coordinator for Clint Eastwood, and they used his face in this to make it somewhat confusing, leaving you wondering if he was also the stranger that rode into town. Clint Eastwood commented one time during an interview at the Actors Studio in 1994 that the earlier versions of the script made the stranger the dead marshal's brother, but Clint Eastwood actually favored a less explicit and more supernatural interpretation of this character. There was also a possible alternate ending that saw the stranger riding away back into the desert wilderness after saying goodbye to Mordecai. He appears confused and suffering from memory loss, and doesn't actually remember arriving or leaving Lago, so he rides to points unknown. That ending would have indicated that the stranger had been possessed by the ghost of Marshal Jim Duncan, and why the stranger doesn't remember anything means that his death had been avenged. It's kind of interesting that one of the headstones in the graveyard actually has the name Sergio Leone as a tribute to the great director. There are also other headstones that bear the name of Don Siegel, who was Clint Eastwood's director on 5 movies, and also in that graveyard is Brian Hutton, the director of Where Eagles Dare and Kelly's Heroes. Clint Eastwood is quoted as saying that he liked to bury his directors. This was a pretty controversial film for its day, and you can kind of understand why this is a revisionist Western that doesn't hold the same cues or standards as the normal Western. For one, Clint Eastwood rapes a girl, which is unbelievable in itself, but the movie was still a big commercial hit, and it's listed in the Motion Picture Guide as one of the best Westerns of the 1970s. Some of the critics were harsh about Eastwood's direction, because they thought he was copying too much from Don Siegel and Sergio Leone. I look at this as learning from the best, with imitation being the best form of flattery, so it doesn't bother me. The film actually holds the 11th position as the highest-grossing Western of the 1970s. The actual amount of paint that they used to paint the town red was 380 gallons, but in the movie, he asks for only 200 gallons. They also used 150,000 feet of timber to build the town of Lago, which translates to lake in Spanish. The majority of the film was shot in the daytime. There were only 3 sections of the movie that were shot at night, and Clint Eastwood is in the last 4 minutes of the movie, but he's basically absent in much of the climax of the film. Shortly after the movie's release, Clint Eastwood actually wrote to John Wayne, and he suggested that they make a Western together. John Wayne ended up sending back a very angry letter in reply. He basically denounced this movie for its violence and its revisionist portrayal of the Old West. Clint Eastwood didn't even bother to answer his criticisms, and consequently, they never worked together. John Wayne did not like this style of movie at all. To take the bad guy and turn him into a good guy, while knowing he's still a bad guy at heart, ruined it for Wayne. The revisionist Westerns of the time always had so much gray area in them, while John Wayne Westerns were pretty cut and dry. You were either good or bad, and that's the way John Wayne saw Westerns. I personally really enjoy this movie. I think it's a well-done film, especially with it being only Clint Eastwood's second directorial effort. I think he does an amazing job making it dark, but still enjoyable to watch, so you might want to check it out the next time you have a chance. If you enjoyed this video, check out the description for links that help support the channel. And as always, thank you so much for watching.